Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening for those of you joining us from across the globe through country offices, networks and partners for this workshop to mark the launch of the IASC guidelines on disability inclusion in humanitarian action. My name is Colin Byrne. I work for Oxfam here in Ireland, and I'm acting as moderator for this event, which has been jointly organised by the Humanitarian Aid Working Group of Dóchas, Dóchas being the umbrella group for INGOs here in Ireland, and the IASC Disability Working Group. Before we introduce the formal agenda, some important housekeeping matters just to highlight. Firstly, it's not practical for us to do a round of introductions, so please feel free to put your name, role and organisation in the chat box to introduce yourself to the other participants. For your information, we will be recording this event. For those of you who are hard of hearing, who have difficulty following discussion, Joseph will be behind the scenes providing captions, and you can find instructions on how to access these in the chat box. When you're not speaking, and to ensure that you don't affect the abilities of others to listen clearly, please ensure that you are on mute. I think we're all accustomed to that rule now over the past year. And while others are speaking and reflections or questions do occur to you, please don't hesitate to put them into the chat function where they are being monitored. And whereas so far as possible, we'll try and include them or integrate them into the conversation. And a big thanks to Lou, Adema and Neve for the technical support throughout this. There will of course be moments where there'll be opportunity to speak directly with the wider group of panelists and participants. So also please feel free to use the raised hand function during these times. So housekeeping out of the way, a quick overview of the structure of the next 2 hours. We'll shortly have introductory remarks from CEO of CBM Ireland and Vice Chair of the Dóchas Board, Sarah O'Toole, and Frank Smith, Head of the Humanitarian Unit at Irish Aid. We'll then proceed to formal introductions to the IASC guidelines themselves, after which we'll provide an opportunity for a short Q&A. This will be followed by a short break, after which we'll then hear presentations from those who are putting the disability guidelines into practice, further to which we'll break into separate groups to explore how the guidelines and good practice might inspire some individual actions and actions within your own organisations and wider networks. We'll then come back into plenary to hear your thoughts before an introduction to the role of the Disability Reference Group and how each of you and all of us collectively might support its work in providing leadership in the delivery of the disability guidelines. So we'll now have some introductory remarks, and I'll ask Sarah O'Toole, CEO of CBM Ireland and Vice Chair of the Dóchas Board, to join us. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Colin, and great to be here and see such a great turnout from far and wide, and really looking forward to this session here this morning. Just to start, I suppose the release of these guidelines could really not come at a better time for the sector, when we're all wrestling with this concept of the new normal and what it will look like, and recognizing also that too many people have been left behind during the response to the COVID pandemic. I believe now is our opportunity to make big changes to the way we work as development actors to include the most marginalized, particularly people with disabilities. For far too long, the risks faced by people with disabilities in crisis settings have been exacerbated by their exclusion from humanitarian preparedness, response and recovery. And the new IASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action provide a real opportunity for humanitarian actors to deliver on their commitment to leave no one behind. And these are the first humanitarian guidelines to be developed by with and by persons with disabilities and their representative organisations, alongside traditional humanitarian stakeholders. And implementing the guidelines demands genuine partnership with organisations of persons with disabilities, or OPDs. Also requires integrated and intersectional approaches to capacity building and mobilising resources for the development of practical tools. The new reference group on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action serves as a great platform for fostering long-term cooperation between the UN, international agencies, NGOs and OPDs in promoting disability inclusive humanitarian response. Thank you. Back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Sarah, for that welcome and recalling that commitment to that now much rephrased of leaving no one behind, and stressing again how the inclusive process of developing the guidelines has sought to put the basic tenets of that commitment into practice. I now invite Frank Smith of the Humanitarian Unit of Irish Aid also to provide us with some introductory remarks. Frank's previous role in the Department of Foreign Affairs includes leading the successful campaign for Ireland's seat on the Security Council and is Director of European Treaty Section. He was also Chief of Staff to the United Nations Legal Council in New York. Frank, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Colin. You can hear me okay? Yep, great. Okay, thanks very much. First of all, good morning to everybody, and many thanks for the invitation to attend today and to make some remarks. Obviously, very happy to be here. Persons with disabilities in humanitarian action is an area that Irish Aid is committed to. While we're making steady progress, it's still an area where we have plenty to learn from other stakeholders. And I'm here very much in that spirit here today. We very warmly welcome the guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities, and we want to acknowledge the hard work of everyone who contributed to them. The process has set high standards for all of us in the humanitarian sector, and putting people with disabilities at the centre and recognising their agency and critical contribution is vital. In my opening remarks, I'll just touch on three points as quickly as I can. Firstly, why the guidelines are so important for the Irish humanitarian sector. Secondly, why we in the Department of Foreign Affairs work on disabilities, inclusion and humanitarian action. And thirdly, just some quick reflections as we move forward. And firstly, just Ireland's humanitarian aid, including the work of, obviously, of the NGO partners, has a strong focus on the most fragile contexts. It's in these contexts where we face the real test of our SDG commitment to leaving no one behind. The States of Fertility Report in 2020, it sounded the alarm bell very clearly. If we don't step up, the furthest behind are at risk of falling even further behind. And that including people living with disabilities in humanitarian action is key to realising our commitment to leave no one behind. The social and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which Sarah just touched on, has hit the most vulnerable the hardest, including people living with disabilities. The pandemic brought to the forefront pre-existing structural inequalities, and now more than ever, we really need to strengthen our targeting of vulnerable groups, including people living with disabilities. These guidelines will help us to do that. But the guidelines are important as they help the Irish humanitarian sector as a whole to strengthen our collective efforts to include people with disabilities. And the collective point is important. It's about financing, programming, and coordination. And the guidelines speak very clearly to all the different stakeholders. And in that context, together we can have the greatest and make the greatest impact. Secondly, just to touch briefly on Ireland's and the Department of Foreign Affairs Irish Aid's work on disabilities, inclusion and humanitarian action. As I mentioned earlier, while we've taken some important steps over recent years, much remains to be done, and it's against this backdrop that I just mentioned the main areas of our work to date. Obviously, firstly, strengthen policy and normative framework. Ireland ratified the Hall, admittedly, in 2018. A Better World has a strong focus on reaching the furthest behind, and a recommitment to working in fragile and conflict-affected areas contexts. We've also recently joined the Global Alliance on Disability, and this is a good opportunity to learn from like-minded donors on what works. And we're also in the process of revising and updating a guidance note for staff on disability inclusive development. This seeks to ensure that the issues relating to persons with disabilities are reflected across our international development policy and programming. Just finally, in this area, Ireland has also adopted the OECD Disability Marker in 2019, and we're encouraging partners to take up the use of this marker. Second point, just in this area, more support for disability programming in our own work and a stronger disability focus across all programming is also part of what we're trying to do. And this includes funding for partners such as Sightsavers, CBM, Children in Crossfire, and others that work specifically with people living with disabilities. And funding for our missions for partners working with people living with disabilities is also part of our work, such as community-based rehabilitation hospital in Tanzania and an umbrella network of organisations in Ethiopia as well. A stronger focus on disability across all humanitarian programming, and that means better data, better stronger analysis, clear prioritization, and strengthened participation and accountability. We've been supporting Dóchas in its work in this area. Just very finally, and I will be brief, system-wide change, in terms of reflections as we move forward, system-wide change requires a system-wide shift. And this means ensuring that all stakeholders implement these guidelines and are held accountable. For Ireland, this is about our funding, but it's also about how we seek to influence, are able to influence and inform our partnerships. And as always, we'll be counting on NGO partners to keep us on our toes in this respect. Implementing the guidelines, I guess, will require time. It'll also require effort, expertise, financial resources, conscious of this, and working in the most fragile contexts and reaching vulnerable people, including people living with disabilities, will not happen without additional investment, and we're committed to playing our part in that. Today, people living with disabilities is high on the agenda across many fora, and there's a sense that there is momentum for tackling this issue. We think we should build on this, and the guidelines give us very useful tools for advancing this issue in a concrete and coherent way. Finally, again, just to thank those here today for their valuable work on this issue, including our NGO partners who have been advocates for the inclusion of people living with disabilities. And it's therefore fitting, we think, that there is an Irish launch of these guidelines today, and we're glad to be here. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Frank. Lots of points there that I think that would be much welcomed within the NGO community here in Ireland. I think particularly that is joining us in the spirit of partnership and learning, which I think is something that we are all very much anxious to do together. I think your perspective here today is an important one as a donor, and not least because of Ireland's presence on the UN Security Council. And it's worth recalling that for the first time in 2019, the same year as the disability guidelines were launched, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2475 on the protection of persons with disabilities in conflict, which was a landmark resolution for the UN Security Council. So for now that we've had introductory remarks, we'll move on to the guidelines themselves. To talk us through these, I'm very pleased to welcome two people. A bit of a tongue twister, Kirsten Lang and Christian Medino-Hug. Kirsten Lang works with UNICEF as a program specialist on disability inclusive humanitarian action based in UNICEF's Geneva headquarters, and provides support to UNICEF's country and regional office and global program. Kirsten is also co-chair of the reference group on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. Christian is the director of the Inclusive Humanitarian Action Unit at CBM Global. He's co-chair of the Global Reference Group on inclusion of persons with disabilities, alongside the International Disability Alliance and UNICEF to help move the global disability agenda forward, and chairs the ELRA Innovation Technical Working Group on Age and Disability Inclusion. After Kirsten and Christian have spoken, we'll have a few moments for open discussion, so please do feel free to put your thoughts and questions in the chat box as both Christian and Kirsten speak. Kirsten, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Colm, and a big thank you to everyone for inviting us to this, to this event. Just maybe to share that other events of similar nature have taken place over the past months in London, in New York. We've had also some launch events in country, like for example in Bangladesh, and so this one is really, is really welcome, and we hope that this would be the beginning of more long-term debate around disability inclusion within the Irish humanitarian sector. So thanks again. I'm going to share my screen now, and you will let me know if you can see my screen now. Can you all see my screen?
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Yes, and you hear me loud and clear. Great, thank you. So I'll then kick us off. We have 25 to 30 minutes, and Christine and myself, we share the presentation. So we'll try to touch on all these elements, trying to explain, why these guidelines are important, how they were developed, the purpose, to whom these guidelines are addressed, and Kirsten will dive a bit more into the content of the guidelines and the specific sections of the guidelines and how they can help, practitioners or other actors. in the right-hand side, you can see the version of the easy-to-read version of the IASC guidelines, which uses, plain language and is meant for persons with, with learning difficulties or cognitive impairments. Okay, so before going into the guidelines themselves, what worth is really putting them in context, because over the past 5 to 6 years, a lot has happening in the sector in terms of moving the disability inclusion agenda forward. And all these examples that you can see on the screen are really, examples of how at different levels, at, policy and other larger framework levels, disability inclusion has been incorporated since 2015. So with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Leave No One Behind agenda, the Sendai framework, which was the first one that included persons with disabilities clearly in the framework, making emphasis on accessibility, universal design, and in line with the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Then, just as a result of the WHS, the development of the Charter, which has currently about 220 agencies that have so far endorsed it. In 2018, the Humanitarian Inclusion Standards were launched. These standards are a sphere companion standard, a part of the Humanitarian Standard Partnership. So, another clear guidance for practitioners. And then at the donor level, there has been a lot of movement as well and developments with DEFID, or the defunct DEFID, so to speak, to, developing a specific strategy around disability inclusion and expecting agencies funded by DEFID to apply the main elements of that strategy. ECHO developing its operational guidelines on disability inclusion, and the IASC guidelines launched in 2019 as well. So there is a lot of going on in the sector at the moment, which can be definitely quite overwhelming, but it shows the importance of making disability inclusion at the center of humanitarian action in order to meet humanitarian principles and accountability. We thought important to maybe spell out a bit more how disability is defined and understood in the guidelines themselves, because it is seen as a combination of two factors. The individual's, impairments, which can be, sensory or physical, intellectual, or of a psychosocial nature, combined with, barriers that the individuals face in accessing services and participating in all acts of life. And these barriers can be of an environmental nature. So physical accessibility, for example, to a specific premises, attitudinal barriers that they face that can be discriminatory in nature, or they can be from cultural or religious barriers that discriminate against certain groups, and in particular persons with disabilities, or institutional, let's say laws or national policies that do discriminate against persons with disabilities, or in existing laws and policies to support the rights of persons with disabilities. So the combination of these two factors, it's what really hinders the real participation and access in equal terms of persons with disabilities to to programs and protection. And when these barriers combined with impairments are combined, this is where the real vulnerability of these groups emerge, and where and that is what humanitarian action needs to prevent. So why these guidelines are important? So you may all know, so 15% of the world population, these are statistics that are well confirmed, are persons with disabilities, and in case of humanitarian crisis, the percentage of persons with disabilities can clearly increase. I mean, some studies show that, you know, the mortality of persons with disabilities can be 2 to 4 times higher than that of persons without disabilities. These persons are heightened risk of violence, of exploitation during crisis, and 75% report not having adequate access to assistance such as water, shelter, food, or other services. Persons with disabilities are not a homogeneous group. They are diverse in their experience, in the way in which they experience the barriers and their participation in humanitarian action. So these guidelines really meant to, you know, to provide all the elements and guidance to the sector on how to include persons with disabilities throughout the humanitarian program cycle, you know, from preparedness through to response and, you know, and recovery. And we know that the inclusion of persons with disabilities tends to be very ad hoc by the sector due to various reasons. Reasons that can be lack of capacity, lack of knowledge or understanding of how to address the needs and support the rights of persons with disabilities. So there is a need for a coherent approach and monitor progress in the sector. And over the past years, because of all the frameworks I mentioned earlier, there is little by little more progress and more engagement, systematic engagement by, you know, by agencies in addressing disability inclusion. But, you know, we feel that the sector is still at the moment quite far behind, and a lot more needs to be done. So the guidelines set out, you know, the key actions that all actors must take in order to effectively, you know, identify the needs and rights of persons with disabilities. And in the guidelines, you will find practical ways of including persons with disabilities in activities and programs, increase their capacities to better perform. So they are, programs are good and satisfactory for persons with disabilities. Understand what they have to do, their responsibilities of the different actors, and how to hold them to account. So accountability is really central to the guidelines, and how to improve the participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in, you know, in crisis response, which is key to make, you know, any response inclusive. So it's not only about access; it is really about their, you know, their participation. So the guidelines are, as I mentioned earlier, you know, they are designed to be used by, you know, local, national, regional, international actors such as governments, UN country teams, programmers, donors, and organizations of persons with disabilities. So if people working in humanitarian contexts use these guidelines, you would definitely help promoting meaningful participation. So persons with disabilities have to participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and, you know, bring knowledge and they have knowledge and skills that they can bring to humanitarian action. The guidelines will help identify and remove barriers. The barriers I mentioned earlier, attitudinal, environmental, and institutional barriers that impede their participation. Help empower persons with disabilities through either capacity building initiatives that develop all this, you know, all these stakeholders' awareness, but also help in terms of developing this dialogue and really needed dialogue between humanitarian mainstream actors and persons with disabilities. And then monitoring inclusion, either through the disaggregation of data, which helps, you know, planning, implementing, and, you know, and monitor programs. So you will all may wonder where these guidelines fit within all the plethora of, you know, guidance and documents that currently exist. And, you know, it can be quite, you know, quite overwhelming and not always, you know, clear, okay, you know, how we can use these when all the documents exist. And we usually get questions from many practitioners as to what is the difference between these guidelines, for example, and the humanitarian inclusion standards. So we use this pyramid that helps helps, put into context the different documents that exist. Those that try to answer, the why do we want to do this? Policy documents, and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is one, but also national policies that governments develop. So that is more at the policy level. Then we have the standards, which answer the question about why, or what do we do? So the sphere fall under this category, and the humanitarian inclusion standards fall under that category. Then the how, and this is what the guidelines, and Kirsten will take us through that later. The guidance really answers the how. It provides, practical examples and recommendations on, how you can make your programs inclusive, depending also on the role that you play in the humanitarian program cycle. And then there are specific tools. So the IASC guidelines do not give you all the tools for a specific activities, but it refers to a lot of the tools that have been developed over the time. And tools such as, for example, the Washington Group set of questions when it comes to, to disaggregate data and get enough data to inform your programming. So finally, before I hand over to Kirsten, the guidelines development was a very, very long process, but extremely consultative process. So as you may know, it was, the guidelines were commissioned after the World Humanitarian Summit, and a IASC team was put in place to develop the guidelines. So it has been a 3-year process with lots of consultations, at regional level, at global level, involving persons with disabilities and other at-risk groups. So we, and a specific core group meetings to validate the findings from the various consultations. So overall, it has engaged more than 600 actors across the globe over these 3 years. So now we are now 2 years on, almost, since the launch of the IASC guidelines, and we can talk later how we are looking at the rollout of these when we present the work of the Disability Reference Group. So on that note, Kirsten, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Just checking you can hear me loud and clear.
Yeah, clear.
Yeah, great. Okay. So I'm going to take us through the guidelines following on from what Christian has just presented. So basically, for those of you who are not yet familiar with the guidelines, they're divided into 3 key areas. So they start off with some introductory chapters, which really present the cross-cutting information that is useful for everybody. So it's the legal and policy framework and how that applies to people with disabilities in humanitarian emergencies. It also addresses overarching principles and approaches such as the twin track approach, accessibility, participation of OPDs, etc. And it sets out the roles and responsibilities of different actors, including government, humanitarian actors, DPOs. The next part of the guidelines is then the sector-specific chapters. So these chapters really apply all of these more general cross-cutting topics to each of the sectors, and we'll have a look in a moment at what that looks like. The guidelines then also have a set of annexes which provide some more practical information and practical tools. They include, for example, more concrete information about provision of reasonable accommodation in humanitarian settings, or example indicators that can be used for monitoring disability inclusion. Next slide. Thanks. So here we have an example of how the sectoral chapters look and how the sectoral chapters are arranged. This example is from the CCCM chapter, the Camp Coordination, Camp Management chapter. So you'll see on the left of the slide, there's a diagram that sets out this concept that Christian also mentioned around persons with disabilities are not inherently vulnerable. Vulnerability is created by the way we design humanitarian assistance. And so the sectoral chapters really aim to provide activities, approaches, strategies to be able to reduce that vulnerability. So on the left, it sets out the specific barriers that increase the risk of persons with disabilities in each of those sectors. The sectoral chapters, as you'll see on the right-hand side, then set out concrete actions at different emergency phases, so at preparedness, response and recovery, but also at different stages of the humanitarian program cycle. So what you see on this slide is assessment, analysis and planning stage. So each of the sectoral chapters is arranged in this way. Next slide. Thanks, Christian. Now this diagram on here, which is basically showing a whole heap of different guidance documents being thrown at humanitarian actors in the field. I imagine that this is something that many of you working in humanitarian action are familiar with. And it's something that all of us who are involved in guidelines development and rollout are very conscious of, and very much trying to ensure that this is not the impression that users of the guidelines have. So in development of the guidelines, we worked very much to ensure that intersectionality was being addressed. So we ensured that the intersection between gender, age and disability is addressed in the guidelines. We also ensured that we worked closely with MHPSS actors in developing the guidelines so that we're not contributing to this siloed approach where disability, age, gender and other issues are dealt with separately. Next slide, thanks. So how can the guidelines be used? They're really intended, as you probably saw from the introduction when I was setting out the structure of the guidelines, you can probably tell they're a very thick document. They're an incredibly rich document, and so they're really intended as a resource document for a number of different purposes. They can be really helpful in terms of developing policies, strategies and standards for your organisation, for example, or for a field operation. They're also really helpful to inform and support organisational change. They're helpful, for example, as a reference for when designing needs assessment or when designing and planning projects. They're also really helpful for the development or revision of existing guidance and resources and tools. So looking at, for example, what sectoral tools already exist and how they can be adapted to be made more disability inclusive, the guidelines can be really helpful for that process. They can also be really helpful to enhance coordination between different actors engaged in promoting inclusion. So they can really set that standard so that everybody is working on inclusion from the same perspective and in the same way. And finally, they're also useful as a reference to monitor and evaluate action and identify learnings. So if we're asking the question of how do we monitor inclusion of persons with disabilities, the guidelines provide some really useful advice around that. Next slide, please. And building on what I was just speaking about, we of course know that the guidelines, they're an incredibly helpful resource, but they're not the only answer. They are a really key tool, but there is a lot more that is needed in order to promote disability inclusive humanitarian action. So one of the factors that we see being needed is organisational change. So having some reflection on how are the guidelines currently reflected in organisational policy and procedures and what changes can be made in that regard. Also looking at capacity development and technical support. So it's not enough just to have guidelines. We need to also be putting in place support to enable particularly colleagues in the field to implement the guidelines in practice. One of the other actions that we've seen being very much needed is sector-specific operational tools. So while the guidelines have chapters for each sector, they're still more of a reference, whereas what we need is those very practical tools for each of the sectors. Building on Christian's point on participation, it's also really important for us to promote more opportunities for exchange of experience and learning between UN entities, NGOs and OPDs. As a short side note related to this, in the process of developing the guidelines, what we found was one of the most valuable processes was bringing together UN agencies, NGOs and organisations of persons with disabilities at the same table to work jointly in developing the guidelines. It's something we're also making sure to maintain in the rollout of the guidelines, and it's something that is essential to successful implementation of the guidelines. So having that sharing of experience and collaboration. And building on that point, opportunity for development of partnerships between humanitarian actors and OPDs is key. And of course, establishing mechanisms to monitor implementation of the guidelines. They may look different for different entities. Next slide, please. So finally, where can the guidelines be found? And I just noticed there was a question on guidelines being translated into other languages. So yes, the guidelines are being translated into other languages. They're available on the IASC website in a number of languages, including English, Arabic, Spanish, and French. They're also available there in accessible versions, and an easy to read version is coming. We have the easy to read version in draft. And we have an email address here on the slide that you can contact for more information on the guidelines. Later on today, you're also going to be hearing a bit about the reference group that's been established to be rolling out the guidelines and addressing some of those issues that I was speaking about earlier around what more is needed for these guidelines to be implemented in practice. So thank you, everyone. I'll stop there and check if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks, Christian, for that very comprehensive overview. Two things really jumped out at me. Sorry, just before I say any more, if anyone does have any specific questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we are monitoring them closely. The two things really jumped out at me. Firstly, I mean, that broader question of organizational culture change required to ensure or to support the implementation of the guidelines. And also, Christian, in your overview of the guidelines and particularly key recent events, it was very striking how recent all of these initiatives, principally since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. And it really struck me yesterday, I had forgotten just how recent the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, just how recent that is as well. It's only from 2006. So a lot of this is all very recent, and back to Frank's point at the outset, as many of us are still very much on a learning curve, and these guidelines and technical standards are only being brought on board now. Thank you, Kirsten, also for addressing the question on the translation of the document. So I think that addresses Clara's question. There is an additional question from Catherine. Catherine, I don't know if you can hear us and if you're able to ask your question directly.
Well, yes, hello. It was just a general thing to keep in mind in over the course of the next sort of hour or two, really. I'm just very interested in how the guidelines mix and interact with this person-centered inclusion analysis. So it relates to the graphic about advocacy. If we look at a person-centered approach, then I'd say, I use the example of women. Women usually have many tasks and little leisure. So inclusion at the analysis might be, here we have a woman. This is her daily life, and incidentally, her daily life, she needs humanitarian intervention like everybody else. How does a woman's daily life and humanitarian needs get interrupted by a disability, rather than postulating, here is a disabled woman? There's an analytical framework there that I will be very interested to hear more experienced practitioners discuss, and explain how the guidelines influence that analysis. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. I think it links with the question of intersectionality as well. Christian and Kirsten, sorry, such a tongue twister to say those two names together. How would do you want to respond to that?
Kirsten, do you want to give a go?
Sure. I think it's a really good point, and I'm really thankful for was it Catherine? Really thankful for Catherine for raising this point, because I think it's a very good one. And yes, it does relate to that slide on the advocacy one, where all the guidance is being thrown at the field colleagues. And the guidelines do attempt very much to follow this approach by ensuring that we are addressing intersectionality very explicitly and ensuring that we're not talking about persons with disabilities as a homogenous group, but we're talking about disability intersecting with gender, with age, with displacement status, with a whole lot of different intersectional identities to impact a person's experience of humanitarian assistance. I think we can probably do a better job at that also in the rollout of the guidelines, and in the reference group, for example, which you'll hear more about later today, we're making sure we're working closely with the gender reference group to ensure that we are paying attention to those gender issues as well and how they impact a person as a whole person, not just as a person with a disability, but also as a woman or a man or a refugee or whatever they may be. I'm not sure if that directly addresses the issue, but I think it is a really important point to raise. So thank you.
I'll just quickly follow up to recognize that intersectionality can itself become a form of identity. And at the end of the day, we're talking about people's lived material realities of life. We are incarnate beings. So, and especially those of us in the West and in the global North, I think at the moment we're kind of riding a horse, a runaway horse of identity and intersectionality that almost becomes a substitute for getting to grips with the messiness of our incarnate life. So when we talk about intersectionality, I am very personally very divided between knowing that runaway horse quite well and saying, yeah, it's a mode of analysis. And also the other part of me that is listening to and with colleagues working with people whose life isn't easily conceptualized that way, because in fact they are a minority discriminated against male or a minority discriminated against female. And incidentally, by the way, they also have a disability. So there's a divide that as global northern or mainstream, or however you want to define it, elites, we just need to be kind of self-aware, self-critical about how we use jargon to move away from the work. But I'm going to shut up now, sorry.
Maybe Colm, if I can just quickly compliment and react to Catherine's excellent point. I think the guidelines as such may not go so much in depth into the intersectionality. It recognizes and acknowledges that intersectionality is important and that data disaggregation is really important to incorporate these intersections and takes that very strong rights-based approach. But I think what is really important for humanitarian actors is to really make sure that when you address some of these issues, you include the right stakeholders. So you might want to include women's disabled organizations, for example, or specific, women's associations into the discussion, so that you are informed also. And the language that you were talking about, the wording, which can be very important when it comes particularly on identity, you collaborate and discuss with these organizations on the ground. No? I think the participation here is key.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks, Catherine, for reminding us of the messiness of the context in which we work sometimes. Other questions coming through here. There's another question from Grace, which is one I can relate to quite strongly. She's asking if any stakeholders are working on nutrition program-specific inclusion.
If I could jump in very quickly, WFP have been working on this, so perhaps I'm not sure if, I don't believe they're part of this session today, but perhaps we could make that connection afterwards.
Great, okay. And another question.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you.
So, and then another question from Bernadette. Bernadette, do you want to come in and ask that question directly in relation to practical tools to support the implementation teams?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christian and Kirsten, for that presentation, really clear.
I suppose my question, because I'm thinking about, you know, my teams on the ground and the actual then doing, and I know you did flag it as an area of what more is needed, but the kind of the practical tools in terms of how to, like, I see the guidelines as a lot of advice in terms of you should look at, you know, assessing the degree to which financial and technology solutions are accessible. But then how do you do that, or the guidance for doing that, and what are the key things that one should be looking at? And I think that's going to be a critical piece in terms of our teams picking up on it. It needs to be practical. I think the guidelines are great at this level, but then send this out to the teams, I think it'll be harder for them to put it into practical action. So maybe it's a work in progress. I know I'm on the DRG, so we're looking at resources, but I just wanted to put it to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernadette. A very good question. And your question, actually, your comment is a recurrent comment that we get also from other agencies and practitioners, saying that the guidelines may be, you know, still a bit too top level, and that there is a need of more specific tools for specific aspects of the work. So, for example, how to do an inclusive feedback mechanism, or when you go to more specific sectoral activities, let's say cash programming, how you make your cash programming inclusive, and what do you need to include and consider to do inclusive cash programming. So maybe later in the section around the presentation of the DRG and the work plan of the DRG, some of these elements are being addressed currently and worked out by some of the working groups in the DRG, so we can present that later.
Great, thanks a million.
Thanks, Bernadette and Christian. Is another question there from Colette. How can the guidelines be implemented in contexts where there are few resources or lack of engagement from policymakers or governments?
Yeah, go ahead, Kirsten.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the big question for us, isn't it? As humanitarian actors, that's always the challenge. I think one of the keys is absolutely what Christian was speaking about before as well, around participation. It's really key to work with organisations of persons with disabilities who are present in most contexts and build their capacity to be able to partner with humanitarian actors in the response. I would say that's definitely one of the keys. I think the key is also this development of tools and resources about how to apply the guidelines. The guidelines will be applied differently in different contexts. If you're working in, you know, a forced displacement setting in Greece compared to a forced displacement setting in Central African Republic, it's going to look very different. So I think it's also about recognising that the guidelines are not the specific tool that you're going to be applying. It's about applying the guidelines in each context. Sorry, that was not a very coherent answer. It was much clearer in my head. Christian, over to you.
Yeah, no, and I think there are differently contexts in which you may not have, you know, well-organized organizations of persons with disabilities, for example. So participation might be a challenge, but you definitely have persons with disabilities in the communities that you can, you know, that you can work with and, you know, and help organize to inform better your programming. No, there are also surely other organizations that have acquired more expertise in disability inclusion, or some organizations that are specifically focused on disability inclusion that you can, you know, that you can work with. And beyond that, and this is work in progress that we're doing as part of the DRG work plan, is really to work and discuss with the cluster systems, so that disability inclusion is incorporated as part of you know, as part of their work. No, so ensuring that at least we can form groups, working groups in country that look at this particular area of work. And for example, there are already examples in some contexts about age and disability working groups that have been established and that, you know, address the needs and rights of persons with disabilities in specific, you know, crisis situations. So as Kirsten was saying, these guidelines need to be adapted and adjusted to each context, but it's not because there are no national specific laws or a specific government that has not endorsed the CRPD, that inclusion cannot be, cannot be done.
Thanks, Christian. Just to take us back to Grace's earlier question about nutrition, Catherine has just said that the Emergency Nutrition Network has good resources on this topic, and these are well accepted guidelines and tools that they produce with other international actors. An additional point here from, I think it's Gannett. I like the point, disability is not a vulnerability per se. More reflection, please.
I mean, I think that the rest of that comment is also interesting in terms of, with scarce resources, there may be a need to prioritise one over another vulnerability. And I think that brings us in some way back to Catherine's point around seeing people as a whole person and not as, a person with a disability only or a woman only. So I think it's less about categorising people and more about just designing an inclusive response. It doesn't need to be about saying this person is more vulnerable than this person. It's about looking at all the different factors that contribute to vulnerability in your specific context and addressing those factors in the response. So ensuring that, for example, at a very practical level, wash facilities are accessible to people who have difficulty seeing or moving around or hearing, and that wash facilities also promote safety for women and girls, for example, rather than focusing too much on categorizing individuals and setting up that hierarchy. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thanks, Kirsten. That's great. I think time is about to catch up on us, and we had scheduled to have a break at this stage in proceedings. Thank you for your questions. Apologies that we don't have time to get into them in more depth at this stage, but we have shared the links to the website where you can find the guidelines and supporting documents. We'll now take a break of 5 minutes, so we'll try and come back on the dot of the hour. And we ask your timely return so we have opportunity to give space to those who are already demonstrating best practice in programming in relation to disability inclusion. So talk to you then. Thank you. I hope you've all had a chance to get some sort of refreshment. Just to apologise for not being able to answer all of the questions in the previous session, but Christian has just asked me to remind you that the Disability Reference Group is working on a Q&A document which they can share in due course, but we can answer questions by email in the year in term if we don't get to them today. So now that we've had a chance to have an introduction to the guidelines and some of the theory, we want to take some time now to be inspired by those well versed in translating the theory into practice. So I'd like to introduce you to Shrinka Delic of CBM and Annie Sloman, my colleague from Oxfam. Each will speak for approximately 5 to 7 minutes, during which we encourage you again to put questions and comments in the chat box, which you won't get to directly, but we would ask that they inform the discussion in the breakout groups. And we'll give you guidance on the great breakout groups immediately after we've heard from our speakers. So first up is Shrinka. Shrinka is CBM Ireland's EU project manager and is currently leading on the Vivid project. She has over 15 years in senior management positions with INGOs in Southeast Europe and numerous consultancies, particularly in the area of poverty reduction, social care via sustainable economic development, and in conflict affected areas. Shrinka, over to you.
Hi, hello everyone. For the beginning, I would like that we see the video. From the technical side, video about the Vivid project. Perfect.
With funding from the European Union Aid Volunteers Initiative, the Vivid Consortium is creating a community of practice comprised of EU organisations working towards disability inclusion in humanitarian action and volunteering. Vivid is developing and implementing inclusivity through policies and procedures, creating a model for the EU to support disability inclusion in volunteering. Vivid Consortium members include the Abilis Foundation, a Finnish NGO which funds projects designed by people with disabilities to promote the rights, participation, education and employment of persons with disabilities in the Global South. ASPEM is an Italian NGO working in Latin America and Africa on intercultural exchange, human rights, health, agriculture and economic development. ASPEM work with schools and youth groups to raise awareness of global issues. The ASPEM approach is characterised by community participation and development. CBM is an international development organisation. CBM work alongside people with disabilities in the world's poorest countries to fight poverty and exclusion and transform lives. CBM have funded over 500 projects in 20 countries, reaching almost 12 million people. The European Disability Forum is an umbrella organisation of persons with disabilities from across Europe. EDF defend the interests of more than 100 million persons with disabilities and operate as a strong, united voice to achieve a Europe where persons with disabilities are fully included in society. Tearfund Ireland is a faith-based international relief and development agency. Working through the local church, Tearfund Ireland is committed to seeing lasting local change. When disasters strike, Tearfund Ireland responds quickly, doing everything they can to protect the most vulnerable. Viatoris Christi is a faith-based, sustainable development and humanitarian organisation, improving access to healthcare, education and opportunities in marginalised communities around the world. VC identifies and addresses clearly defined needs and tackles the root causes of poverty by engaging and resourcing long-term volunteer expertise and working in solidarity with local staff. VC's vision is a world of freedom, justice and peace.
Okay, just give me a second. Sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen.
We can see it, Swinka.
But yeah, I think that I have wrong screen. I don't know why, just give me a second, please. Okay, definitely not technical. You see presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for this. You saw the great video produced by our partners, Tearfund for conference months and a half ago, and actually you saw the all partners part of the Vivid project. Vivid project is, as you saw in the video, is EU-funded project with three main objectives, where actually our goal is to build up community of practice from organization who will be able to bring really who will build capacity in inclusion, humanitarian action and volunteering between members and sharing this learning with the sectoral and the public. This project is actually learning project and a capacity building project. Some of our organization will become certificate organization as a sending organization for deployment of volunteers, and all organization will have action plans and put into practice accessibility and will become leader in accessibility field related to humanitarian action. Why actually we doing? As we heard before, 15% of world population is facing with some kind of disability, and actually in humanitarian context, the mortality rate is 2 or 4 times higher than person with disabilities. That's why actually we would like to build capacity of organizations who act in the humanitarian response to increase accessibility in their work. During these 2 years, it's 2 years project, and of course, because of COVID, most of activity were transferred to be online. But one of the first activity was assessment, where actually we assess the current level of capacity of our organization in humanitarian experience, volunteering experience and accessibility. With this assessment, we determine the baseline of each organization, then each organization set up the goals, and we develop action plans how to reach these goals through this project. We had in the same time we had lots of trainings on accessibilities, EU grant management, introduction to disabilities. Actually, we will learn how to our everyday work become more accessible. We organized, actually, Viatori Christi, our partner, organized the conference on volunteering management, where we launch a research report on online inclusive volunteering. And of course, you can find this report on some of our webpage. I will show you on the end. And we organize a lots of webinars through our partner EDF, and you can find on their web page, you can find all these webinars about disability inclusion, volunteer management, and humanitarian action. For 2021, it's a really busy year because of pandemic situation. The most of the activities are actually supposed to be implemented in 2021, and we still hope that we will be able to organize some face-to-face events and some conference, not just online. But for now, we had the institutionalization training and conference months and a half ago, where we were talking about actually stopping and avoiding volunteerism in orphanage. Conference was really great, with a great panelist and great sharing experience. Then at the moment we are going through inclusive project cycle management training, again through sharing experience from different countries. At the moment we shared the experience from the partnership organization from Nepal and Bangladesh. Next week we're starting with a set of trainings about the Bridge Article 11 and core humanitarian standard. Then we will prepare guidance documents on CRPD, guidelines on accreditation scheme for organization for sending volunteers with disability, and research papers about this project. All lessons learned we will share with audience and with our partners, and we will organize some dissemination event. So actually that's in general and very short about this project, and more information you can find on our websites. You can see here. Thank you.
Thanks, Rinke, and I think it's really interesting to see the level of the sort of steps in terms of institutionalization of the guidelines, putting them into practice. I'm really struck by, I think the World Health Organization noted about 6 months into the COVID-19 response that even basic data collection by member states around disability and COVID was almost non-existent. So really important to make sure that those initial steps in introducing the guidelines and translating policy into practice gets some meaningful momentum at the outset. Okay, next up is Annie Sloman. Annie, thank you for joining us at this late hour. I should say Annie is in Timor-Leste, so she's, I think, approximately 8 hours ahead. So you're very welcome. Annie is an international development and humanitarian practitioner that has been working in the Asia-Pacific region for over 18 years. And he's been a passionate champion of disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction and humanitarian action, which has been an increasingly big focus of work in recent years. She's presently the Associate Country Director of Oxfam in Timor-Leste. Annie, the floor is yours. You're very welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Coleman. It's great to be here. My internet's a little bit choppy right now, so let me know if there's any issues. But also, if people can maybe turn off their videos just so that my internet might be a little bit stronger, that would be great. I've been dropping in and out a little bit. So I'm going to share with you an example of inclusive local humanitarian leadership in Timor-Leste that's just happened. And it's a really interesting example of the guidelines in practice. and some learnings that we can share with you from the Timor-Leste context. And I think one of the interesting things I noticed was that Adina earlier asked about what about contexts with few resources and lack of engagement from government. And so Timor-Leste does come into that category, and there has been previously lack of engagement from government. So I think this is a really interesting example to demonstrate that. So Timor-Leste was hit by bad floods in the 5th of April this year. And 33,000 households were affected, which is about 15% of the population. So for a small country like Timor-Leste, it was a really, really big disaster, and it had major impacts on infrastructure, on households, and of course on persons with disabilities, particularly as persons with disabilities often live in areas that are of higher risk for disasters. And so one of the things I'm really going to share about today is the role that Organisation of Persons with Disability, Rais Hadomi Timoron, RHTO, played in this response, and how they were supported to really play a key role and be a real leader in this response. So the first thing is that within hours, RHTO was responding. Here you can see a person that they helped evacuate, a member of RHTO, and this person is at an evacuation centre. So they supported evacuation of people. They undertook assessments in evacuation centres with Oxfam within 12 hours of a disaster happening. And this particularly looked at accessibility of evacuation centres as well as persons with disabilities needs. In this next photo, the middle person, Edu, who is the wheelchair user, he's a staff member of RHTO, but he was also badly affected. So he actually woke up in the middle of the night with his neighbours knocking on his door, opened the door and the water came in. And within minutes, he was literally swimming, and he and his family needed to be carried out the disaster. And RHTO, as other colleagues, were actually waiting for him to evacuate him to an evacuation centre. And Paulus, who is on his side, is actually collecting data from him. So he's at the evacuation centre at this point, and they're actually talking about and doing an assessment and looking at what are the specific needs of the evacuation centre there and of persons with disabilities. You can see in this evacuation centre, you can actually see to the left of the photo a whole lot of wheelchairs. It's a little bit blurry. And one of the things in this evacuation centre, there were a lot of persons with disabilities using wheelchairs, but there was inaccessibility. Toilets and washing facilities weren't accessible. We had to do quite a lot of advocacy to get wash actors to build an accessible toilet. And so there were just key things like this that were really important, that there were persons with disabilities actively looking at these issues and advocating within the humanitarian system for response. One of the really exciting things in this response was that government recognised RHTO's role and disability inclusion. Within the first response coordination meeting that happened within 24 hours, led by the government actually singled out RHTO and spoke about how important their role is and how persons with disabilities need to be included. And this was a big change from previous responses. So we'd actually had a flood 12 months earlier, and that flood was the first time that a DPO or an OPD had engaged in a government-led response and been recognised. And during that response last year, the government was actually really hesitant to have RHTO to play a role. Oxfam and international organisations had to really push the government to allow that space to be there. The government was scared that if a person with disability was in the field collecting assessment data or so forth, that it might put them at risk or they might not be able to do it. And so what we've seen between this last response and the current response is a real shift in people's understanding of the important role that DPOs can play, as well as the government's understanding of the importance of persons with disabilities needs being met, and that they specifically need to be identified and targeted. Actually, in this photo that you can see here, which is of people standing up, we have the Secretary of State for Civil Protection, which is the government lead for disaster. We have members of the Australian Embassy who have been really key in funding disability inclusive DRR and humanitarian action. And we have members of RHTO. And what's actually happening is it's a handover ceremony for goods that RHTO will be distributing on behalf of the government to persons with disabilities. And what was really cool with this distribution is RHTO were actually able to mobilize resources and undertake a distribution to meet persons with disability needs before the government was doing distributions and before most INGOs were doing distributions and responding to needs. So they were actually able to mobilize quicker, and through their networks of persons with disabilities were able to actually identify the needs of those members. And in this photo, you can see Edu, who we heard earlier, was affected, actually providing some of that support. Another really key role that RHTO played in the response was the assessment of the government-led household needs assessment, as well as multi-sectoral assessments. And you can see one of the RHTO members undertaking that assessment. Again, we saw really interesting changes between previous responses and this current response. The previous response, the assessment had been terrible about inclusion. There was one question, it didn't capture disability inclusion, really, it didn't capture needs, there was no disaggregation of data. RHTO actually last year did a submission to government and critiqued this and offered suggestions and solutions. This assessment template that was used this time was still not perfect. Unfortunately, it didn't include the Washington Group questions, but it was better. And so we're seeing a recognised difference in assessment templates, in evacuation centre data that's being collected and so forth. There's a bigger recognition of the importance of disability inclusive data. Working in partnership was also really key. So in this photo, you can actually see RHTO and a whole lot of other local organisations about to go on those assessments. And so working together and showing persons with disabilities as key actors in the response was really key. And having those relationships that I heard people talk about earlier between disaster and non-disability actors is really important. Here again, we're seeing another photo of relationships that have been built prior to the disaster. So in this photo, we're actually seeing members of the Australian Humanitarian Consortium Partnership, which is a series of Australian NGOs that work in Timor. And within that consortium, we've been working on DRR projects, and RHTO have been a key role player in that. And so that has then led to the response, those actors actively working with RHTO, drawing on their technical support and engaging with them on that. And you can see here Abilio from RHTO. He's playing a key role in a distribution and evacuation centre. So how do we actually get to this point? Was this response so inclusive? Not perfect, but there were some great things. So one of the key things was investment in relationships with DPOs and partnerships with DPOs prior to the disaster happening. An investment in capacity building of both DPOs so that they understand better about disasters and be able to take on a technical role, but also for mainstreamed humanitarian actors to have a better understanding of disability, as well as how to actually do it in practice and know that they can draw on DPOs. So training and capacity building. Here's a list of sort of key learnings. I won't go into them, but I'll let them just sit here for a sec because I know that time is tight. But, you know, looking at advocacy, looking at partnership, looking at capacity building, resourcing DPOs so they play these roles, ensuring that humanitarian actors are taking responsibility for disasters and disability inclusion in disasters, and supporting creating space for DPOs and identifying persons with disabilities needs are really, really key within this work, and are outlined really, really clearly in the guidelines. Thank you.
Annie, that's great. Really appreciate it. I think something that really stuck out for me was the emphasis on not just on vulnerability and inclusion, but actually on agency and leadership, which I think were very prominent in your presentation. I only wish we had more time, and maybe at some later occasion as part of the humanitarian community here in Ireland and with the Disability Working Group, we could draw on both your time and Shrinka's to talk about things in more detail. So thank you, and thank you again for particularly at this very late hour. Now that you've all been introduced to the guidelines and we've heard from those already promoting disability, we're going to break you into groups as part of breakout sessions. And we'd like to ask you 3 specific questions. So firstly, what practical, and we put these questions into the chat box, so what practical actions or steps can your organisation take to apply the disability guidelines? What actions can or should Dóchas take, and how could donors support the guidelines? We take just 10 minutes for this exercise, during which we'll ask you to identify one note taker who then feed back to the rest of the group. We won't ask you to feed back on everything, maybe just to highlight one or two specific points that you felt were very prominent in your discussion. You'll be provided with a Jamboard on which to work, and you should have all the instructions in the chat box now. So I'm going to hope that this works smoothly. Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope that provided you, even if just some limited space, to start to initiate discussion amongst people across the sector. I'm just trying to look at the board here to see what issues emerged as part of, what key issues emerged as part of the discussion. In terms of, I think it's probably unlikely that everybody got to all of the questions or even got beyond one question. But I think looking...
Just to flag, Colin, we didn't even use that. We just did verbal, sorry.
That's absolutely fine, Bernadette, and likewise in the group that I was in as well. We were...
Yeah, same here. Sure.
We got so stuck in.
Bernadette, is there anything from within your group that you'd want to highlight?
I mean, I think the big thing for a couple of us there was the sort of inconsistent or ad hoc-ness of our addressing people with disabilities. And, you know, around that question of practical action then was around, one, creating awareness that these guidelines are there. But then secondly, which I kind of raised earlier, was coming up with, well, whatever tools, the very practical side for our teams to utilise. Because I think it's one thing creating the awareness, but then we really have to work with our teams to make it practical, so to support them in that work, and perhaps to integrate within other tools. You know, you have Sphere, you have ESGBV, you have multiple other toolkits, and whether it's us in our organisations coming up with something that gives them guidance across that, maybe that intersectionality, but so that they're not seen to go out and collect a whole other, you know, assessment and data for a specific group. I think they were the big things. Maybe anyone in the group, David, could interject.
Thanks, Bernadette. No, I think you've captured it. I think one of our colleagues on the group there said also about, you know, kind of tackling perceptions and kind of preconceived ideas, you know, and you know, really at kind of the different levels around disability and inclusion of people living with disabilities. It is an important step also.
Thanks, David. Do any of the other groups want to come in? Noting in particular, one of the groups highlighted the importance of inclusion of disabled people's organisations in emergency preparedness and planning, which I think builds on the work that Annie highlighted in Timor-Leste.
We didn't, Colin, Anita here, we didn't actually, we used the whiteboard. We were technologically challenged. Well, we didn't get the link until half of the way, and it was only 7 minutes. But I think, and it's only two of us, Grace from Irish Aid, I mean, I'm sure she's, you know, plenty to say. But I suppose in terms of the what can organizations do, I know that in GOAL we're trying to make it, to introduce, if you like, reporting on people with disabilities reached across all our projects. You know, I mean, we are doing it in some of them. We have, you know, good practices across regions and so on. But the aim now is to do it across, and you're talking about 110 projects ongoing at the, you know, at the same time, because, and that's a practical thing, I suppose, because I think once we know how many people we're reaching, then I think there is more of an impetus to then introduce interventions, you know, to include them, etc. Right now, having said that, of course, there is also a lot of the work in the background going on in terms of changing, looking at the policies, looking at the, you know, procedures, looking at recruitment, everything, you know, to truly mainstream, you know, disability. but I'm talking about my team, which is monitoring and evaluation. We report regularly on the number of people we reach in goal, with a gender breakdown, age group breakdown, and type of sector, etc. But that's something that we intend to do in goal. Then we talked about the donor, but maybe I let Grace talk about that part.
Yeah, no, I was just I'm just interested to know, like my feeling is that do the donors actually have enough information regarding this whole disability inclusion concept? Because it's like just kind of some conversation I had in the past with ECHO and people like that. They were lost. They didn't understand what we were talking about. They didn't understand it. They didn't get it. And my feeling was that they didn't have enough information. So that was just, I was just wondered, perhaps that's getting better nowadays. I'm not sure, but yeah, I just wondered about that, the lack of information.
Grace, can you clarify what ECHO didn't get?
Well, we were talking about, including people with disability in the various the program level. And so, they just asked questions, but they didn't respond. They didn't have any, they didn't appear to be knowledgeable about it.
Okay.
So I just came away feeling that they didn't understand, didn't have enough information.
Okay. Well, I guess the importance of events such as this one is to start to introduce guidelines to give people the tools to start to address disability and inclusion. And I think we discussed earlier as well the importance of organizational culture change, and that does take time. I think it also highlights the importance of champions, and I should stress that there are many disability champions on this call, and Anita has been one of the most prominent both internationally and domestically, but I know there are many others on the call also who've been very active in that regard. I'm just conscious of time, and I think at this stage we do need to move on to the final section. Just to say, this isn't the end of a conversation, but really the start of one. And I hope simply by starting to ask questions now, we will start to inform the steps that we might take next. The next section then we're going to talk about, which is the final element of this morning's session, is to talk about the Disability Reference Group. And I'm going to invite Christian to rejoin us. I hope Christian is still there.
I am.
Right. So this provides us with the opportunity to understand the overall coordination structures within the sector to promote disability programming. And again, as previous sessions, please put your thoughts or questions in the chat box as we move along. So over to you, Christian.
Great. Thank you, Cole. So yes, I will present now the Disability Reference Group, and a point of clarification, because people tend to get confused. Whilst the IASC guidelines were launched, the task group that was in charge of the guidelines ended as well. The Disability Reference Group was then created, but it's not part of the IASC structure at the moment. We are seeking ways to be an IASC group at some point, but at the moment we are not. So we are an independent body, not linked to the IASC, but we have a lot of coordination with the IASC, so I will explain. So the platform, the Disability Reference Group, was created last year, in February last year. It was during the Humanitarian Network Partnership Week where it was launched. So it's pretty much a group that is in its infancy still, but it's a unique group. I mean, there is no other group like this that combines organizations of persons with disabilities, mainstream organizations, and UN entities into one single body to coordinate and advocate for disability inclusion and humanitarian action. So it's really a body that helps coordinate. We are very much connected and working with other international platforms and bodies. I mentioned IASC results groups, particularly the result group 2 on inclusion and accountability, but also with the cluster systems, Sphere, the core humanitarian standards, so the CHS Alliance, and other groups. So really is a unique group that brings all actors engaged in disability inclusion. So it's currently chaired by CBM, UNICEF, and the International Disability Alliance. And Christian and myself are one of the two co-chairs. The other co-chair is Elham Yousefian, the humanitarian advisor at the International Disability Alliance. So the current status of the group, I mean, we meet on a monthly basis. And as I said earlier, we connect with many other groups. We have a monthly newsletter that we distribute as widely as we can. And it brings information about, sector developments in disability inclusion by specific organizations, but also events on disability inclusion in the humanitarian space that are taking place, new guidance that are developed, etc., etc. The membership is open, so we do not have at the moment any restrictions for the membership of the group. We have about 150 members at the moment. So in this chart, you can see how the membership is currently being, how the pie is shared between members. So you see that, for example, we have 35% is our mainstream organizations, mainstream non-governmental organizations. But then we have quite a significant number of OPD representatives from global to country level, 13%. We are keen to engage more DPO membership in the group. Is really critical in terms of fostering further this ongoing dialogue and mutual collaboration between humanitarian actors and and DPOs. But we have also local mainstream organizations and obviously UN entities. There is a small percentage of individual experts, so consultants that work in this area, or academics, or some representatives from from private sector. So this is the composition of of the DRG. And quite recently, about 6 to 7 months ago, we developed a work plan. It's a 2-year work plan that has 3 main pillars. So one is on the operationalization, of the guidelines as such. Another pillar really covers, the participation and ensuring how persons with disabilities can participate and engage more robustly in humanitarian action. And another pillar looks at mainstreaming disability inclusion in ongoing processes. So work that, other platforms and working groups are currently working on. So for example, the core humanitarian standard review. So we support how to make it more inclusive, the work plan of the results groups of the IASC, etc. I would not go a lot into the details of the work plan, but we have 7 working groups within the DRG focusing on different aspects. So there is one group that is working on sensitization and learning. This group is currently led by Humanitarian Inclusion and International Rescue Committee. So it's really looking at current practices and capturing all these practices and good examples so that they can be shared within the sector. But it looks also at learning materials that are currently being developed and that can be shared also with the sector. So earlier there were some questions about specific tools. So this group is really looking at capturing those those materials and be able to present it in a format that is accessible for for entities. There is another group led by WHO, which is really putting a technical support proposal, so a function or a mechanism that will allow organizations to access to get specific technical assistance around disability inclusion. Then a group that is, as I said, a few groups that are supporting ongoing processes. So I mentioned already UNHCR leading a group to support IASC RG2, OCHA and ICVA leading another working group on disability inclusion throughout the humanitarian program cycle, and then another one supporting the CHS Review Alliance, and that one is chaired by the CHS. And finally, 2 other groups that are more focus on engagement of persons with disabilities. So one chaired by CBM and the International Disability Alliance. This is really about developing and deliver awareness raising and sensitization to OPDs and mainstream organizations. So develop training materials and building a lot on past trainings like the Bridge Article 11 training, which are already trainings that are well established in the sector. And then a final group that is, it's currently changing and evolving, but it's led by the World Institute on Disability, and that really tries to bring, a safe space where OPDs can exchange their experience in humanitarian action and support developing key messages that they think are important for humanitarian actors to, to consider as they integrate more inclusive approaches into their practice. So basically, this is what we are currently doing, and as I said earlier, we are really trying to, to promote more membership of the group, and and link with other relevant bodies. So it could be interesting to check, maybe a reflection for all of you, how the Dóchas group, humanitarian group, could engage with the DRG moving forward. So I leave it there.
Thanks, Christian. Really interesting. 150 members and 7 separate work streams is no small workload to keep oversight of. I was struck in particular by your pie chart about the small percentage of national actors that appeared to be involved. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. The DRG is really a global platform. No, it's intended to remain global and high level, but we are keen to have national actors engaged as well, because they have lots of experience to bring to the to the discussions. But it might well be that, well, one of the reasons why we still have probably low membership is because the information has not really reached out the local level. No, we have not promoted significantly the DRG at at national level so far. So that's one one potential reason. But another one is because they may not see the need to be involved in these global platforms, which can be very time consuming for for local actors. There are other ways for national actors to be involved in disability inclusion, and I mentioned earlier these age and disability working groups that are created at country level, where they connect with with the cluster system, and they use those platforms to coordinate all aspects related to this age and disability inclusion, for example, and they might see that as a more meaningful body to engage in.
Great. I see one of the suggestions in the chat is that the Humanitarian Aid Working Group and the Disability Working Group of Dóchas might meet at some point to discuss how we might implement the guidelines. But in terms of the Disability Reference Group, noting that some of the Dóchas members are already members of the Disability Reference Group, perhaps opportunities for linkages there. Are there examples from other countries where the DRG, the Disability Reference Group, would link with sort of national entities rather than individual, so networks and alliances as opposed to individual organizations?
Mm-hmm. Kirsten, if you want to jump in, otherwise I'm happy to respond.
No, please go ahead, Christian. Please go ahead. Yeah.
No, as I said, Colm, at the moment we are prioritizing linking with the global bodies. I mean, it was already extremely time-consuming to bring the cluster systems up to speed. For example, we have the MHPSS IASC reference group and the gender reference group that we want to develop more interaction with. We have the IASC structure with the various results groups that we need also to influence and support, embed disability inclusion within their processes. So all of that is hugely time consuming. So we expect members of the DRG though to try to use you know, all the information and the discussions and learnings in the DRG group, to bring that to the country level, and as much as possible to keep informed the DRG of how things are evolving at country level, and bring any good practices, you know, either in terms of coordination, either in terms of working with persons with disabilities, to the DRG as good examples of how progress is, you know, is evolving.
Great. Catherine has made the point, reinforcing yours, I think that the national groups are task heavy and time poor, and incentives and pathways have to be made for them by those who hold power. Maybe the DRG can create a working group for these national organisations. Could I ask maybe one thing, just in terms of, I mean, one thing that doesn't always happen, even in our own context here in Ireland, is linkages with disability rights organisations on this island. So this partnership with local or national entities, or specific disability focused organisations, could be another opportunity also. I'm just reading down through the chat. Someone's asked how we can, what's the criteria? Again, it's asked, what's the criteria for joining the DRG?
So, I mean, the criteria really is for organizations that want to become a member, as much as possible to contribute to the work of the DRG. I mean, it's not compulsory. I mean, out of the 150 members that we currently have, let's say that we have 1/3 that are very actively involved in the working groups, bringing their experience, etc. Other members are more there to, you know, to learn, to be informed of how things are, you know, are evolving, and maybe use that learning also in their, you know, in their practice. So there is not a specific criteria other than, be a registered, you know, organization, and willing to contribute.
Well, I think by the looks of the chat in the box, it may just be that this has been quite a successful recruitment campaign for the DRG. And Kirsten has put in the box some links for the reference group if anybody wants more information or wants to make direct contact. But I think certainly opportunity for us as a sector here in Ireland to put our heads together and to think about how we could support or even distribute our resources across the various working groups as well. Okay, I'm conscious that we're now running towards the end, and we had left space for Sarah to come in and provide some concluding remarks. So we might start to wrap up now. I hope this event has been informative for all of you and has provided you with access to information and networks and contacts of like-minded peers in other organizations, and prompted some thinking for your own organization as well. As I said earlier, Dóchas does have a disability working group and a humanitarian aid working group, and I think clearly an outcome of this meeting is that we need to work more collaboratively and put our heads together. And maybe it might be useful, Lou, if we can put in the chat box for those who may not be members of the disability working group or the humanitarian aid working group, contacts for those two work streams within Dóchas. So at this point, can I just say a big thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for making the time this morning. I realize that 2 hours is a big chunk of your time, but to us it's important. And I think it's important to all those who have felt excluded or marginalized that we give our time and attention to this matter. I'm now going to pass over to Sarah O'Toole for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Colm. Thanks, everyone. I've been making notes here of what's really stood out, and so much has stood out on this session today. First of all, great to have such good attendance, but also real participation of everyone. And I think everyone has been motivated here, and listening to the great speakers we've had. I think first we kicked off with Frank from Irish Aid, and Frank, I always note down every word that someone from Irish Aid says, and the key thing you said for me was the commitment of Irish Aid to play your part on disability inclusion and around additional investment. So I really look forward to hearing more about that. Then Christian and Kirsten, great presentations, and I think what's come out of this is the requirement or the the requests for further discussions around the guidelines, maybe further training sessions. And from that, I'm co-chair of the Disability Working Group with Mary O'Connell from Mission Cara, and certainly there's great scope here to collaborate with our colleagues on the HOG working group and looking at possibly talking a bit more and sharing learnings and experiences. Anita had spoke about what GOAL are doing. I think that's always really helpful within the sector. We're great at collaborating and sharing, and really to bring those stories back to your colleagues in your own organizations. Oftentimes we attend these workshops and seminars and we go back to our colleagues with great ideas, and everyone is too busy in their own pieces that they're working on. But I think the more we can share and learn from each other, the better things can move forward. In terms of the guidelines, the things that stick out for me there are, one, around building your capacity and your resources to actually deliver on commitments around leaving no one behind and being accountable, but more importantly, around participation of people with disabilities and their representative organizations from the beginning. And then we also then heard from Zorinka around the Vivid project, which obviously I know quite a bit about. And then from Annie, talking from Timor-Leste. And a key thing Annie said was what happened, their experience of RHTO was that it wasn't perfect, but it was better. And I think that's key. We shouldn't be waiting. She also talked about not waiting for the disaster to happen, to start now, and the way they built relationships between government and between organizations, which led up to when that disaster happened, they were ready to act. So obviously for people to keep pushing governments in the countries that worked in to be more inclusive and recognize the role of OPDs, who are can be key actors in humanitarian response. I think really that was it. I mean, there was so much to take from today. Certainly we as a disability focused organization, we have noticed a significant increase in the discourse around disability inclusion over the last couple of years. We always say the time is now, you know, don't wait for perfection, just let's move forward. And I think this has been a great platform from which we can spring from and really bring the discussion further and see some real action in this area. So thanks to everyone for your participation. And certainly we will talk again. Encourage any of you who aren't members of the Disability Working Group to please join. We have some great members there and some great work we're doing, and look forward to collaborating further with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And can I just say a big thank you to Lou, Niamh, Adima and Joseph as well for your support throughout the afternoon and making sure that nothing went wrong, and nothing did. So everything, all of the technology worked perfectly smoothly, and thank you for keeping me on my toes throughout. Thank you all, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.